2 DNA profiles, 2 men, 1 coordinated operation. And as of early May 2026, sources connected to the federal investigation indicate that one of those men has been taken into custody in connection with the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old woman who has not been seen in over 100 days. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 100 days, 3 months and change, 100 mornings without an answer, 100 evenings where a porch in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona sat empty in the desert dark. 100 days during which federal investigators built an evidentiary architecture that most local law enforcement agencies would not have the resources or jurisdiction to reach. And at the end of those 100 days, the FBI found something, a theory. Not a tip from a podcast or a thread on a forum. A documented structural link connecting 2 individuals to a coordinated operation had been years in the making before it was ever executed. This channel does not speculate. Every claim you are about to hear is drawn from verified law enforcement statements, confirmed forensic findings, documented court records, and named on-record sources. Where something has not been officially confirmed, you will be told. That distinction matters in a case that has been surrounded by noise since the first hour it went public. This documentary is going to give you is the signal underneath the noise. The FBI found the link. Before this video is over, you will understand exactly what that link is, why it took 100 days to fully document what the single most consequential question in this case still is. Nancy Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She was 84 years old when she disappeared. She had lived in Tucson for more than 5 decades, longer than most of the investigators now working her. Case have been alive. She arrived in the Sonoran Desert as a young woman and never left. The Catalina foothills became her world. The dry heat, saguaro silhouettes against the dusk sky, the particular quiet of a desert neighborhood after dark. She raised 3 children in that environment: Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. She buried her husband Charles in 1988 after he passed during a mining trip in Mexico. She was 46 years old when that happened. She did not leave. She did not collapse. She built from the ground up and never once asked for attention doing it. By 2026, that life had a specific shape, a home she knew completely, garden she tended with the discipline of someone who understood that things in the desert require careful attention or they die. Church she attended without exception, a porch where she watched the desert evenings come in. A routine so consistent, so predictable, so thoroughly mapped by the rhythms of decades in the same place, that someone with access to it could account for every variable. At 84, physical condition had changed in ways that her family and her doctors understood, and that she accepted with the practical clarity of someone who never once confused vulnerability with defeat. Limited mobility, daily cardiac medication, planted cardiac regulating device monitoring her heart around the clock. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed it publicly, and without softening, she could not walk 50 yards by herself. That statement was not made carelessly. It was made to establish on the record the precise physical reality of Nancy Guthrie's daily existence in January 2026. Now ask yourself the question that the FBI's investigation has been asking since February 1st. If you were building an operation that required complete control of a subject from the moment of entry to the moment of transport, what would the ideal target profile look like? Limited mobility, medication dependency, a cardiac condition that responds acutely to physiological stress, a home with cameras that were not actively storing footage, a family with a predictable schedule that you already knew, financial profile substantial enough to justify the operational risk. Nancy Guthrie matched every variable on that list, and according to sources familiar with the investigation, someone knew that. Not because they had studied her from a distance, because they had sat at her dinner table, because they had walked through her home, Because they had 20 years of embedded access to every detail that made her, from a purely operational standpoint, most accessible target for exactly this kind of coordinated abduction. On the evening of Saturday, January 31st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie did something she had done many times before. She called an Uber and arrived at her daughter Annie's home at 5:32 in the evening for a family dinner and game night. She ate, she laughed. She spent the kind of evening that families take for granted until they cannot anymore. When the night wound down, it was Annie's husband who offered to drive her home. Tommaso Cioni, Annie's husband, sixth grade science teacher, who had been part of the Guthrie family since 2006. He drove Nancy the 10-minute route back to her home on North Camino Escalante in the Catalina foothills. He walked her to the front door, confirmed she was safely inside. At 9:50 p.m., the garage door closed. He drove away. That moment, completely ordinary, completely unremarkable, kind of thing that happens in families every weekend across every city in this country, became the last confirmed normal moment of Nancy Guthrie's life. For nearly 4 hours after that garage door closed, nothing unusual registered, no alarm triggered, no distress signals sent. Whatever happened inside that home did not happen immediately. It happened in the deepest part of the night, when the street was empty and the neighborhood was asleep and the desert had gone completely still. Operation was timed to that stillness deliberately. At 1:47 a.m. on February 1st, 2026, a figure appeared at the front door of Nancy Guthrie's home, dressed entirely in black, nitrile gloves on both hands, a 25-liter Ozark trail hiker backpack sold exclusively at Walmart, strapped tightly to back, a holstered firearm visible at the front of the body, a flashlight held between the teeth with both hands kept deliberately free. Figure walked directly to the doorbell camera. Not a scan of the porch, not a moment of hesitation at the threshold. A direct, deliberate walk straight to the exact location of the lens. The walk of someone who had rehearsed this motion enough times that it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like procedure. 2 taps on the door, calm, rhythmic. Then foliage from a nearby potted plant placed over the camera lens, not grabbed from the nearest pot within reach. Taken from a specific plant, positioned at a specific angle that created a specific blind spot in the camera's field of view. That level of placement precision does not come from a first visit to a property. It comes from prior observation, from knowing exactly which plant creates which blind spot because you have stood at that door before and identified it. Rear floodlights had already been disabled before the front door approach began. Not disabled during the approach, before it, which means there was a second operator at the rear of the property managing the secondary entry point simultaneously while the primary operator managed the camera and the front door. 2 points of entry, 2 operators coordinated to the second. At the exact moment the camera went dark, 1:47 a.m., the cardiac regulating device implanted in Nancy Guthrie's chest logged what forensic sources describe as an acute physiological stress response. Not 1 second before 1:47 a.m., not 1 second after 1:47 a.m., the same timestamp, the same second the camera was covered. Synchronization is the forensic anchor of this entire investigation. It tells you that the moment the camera was disabled, contact was made inside that home. Immediate, simultaneous, planned. The 2 operators knew exactly where Nancy would be inside that home at 1:47 in the morning because they had mapped her sleep pattern in advance. The device continued logging. For the next 41 minutes, it recorded a pattern that forensic sources describe as consistent with sustained extreme physiological stress in a conscious individual. The heart was beating. The brain was registering what was happening. Nancy Guthrie was awake, aware, experiencing something that her cardiac device was documenting with clinical precision in real time. Then, in the final minutes before 2:28 a.m., pattern shifted. The heart rate variability changed in a way that forensic sources describe as consistent with the introduction of a pharmacological compound into the subject's system. Something was administered inside that home. Something that required preparation, dosage calculation, and specific knowledge of how it would interact with an existing cardiac condition and an existing medication regimen. It's not improvisation. That is medical knowledge applied deliberately to a specific individual's documented health profile. At 2:28 a.m., device stopped syncing to its bedside monitoring unit. Not because Nancy's heart stopped, because the vehicle carrying her drove beyond Bluetooth range. At 2:28 a.m. on February 1st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie was alive. Her heart was beating. Trail went completely cold. When Pima County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the home the following morning, after a welfare check call was placed, what they found inside was a scene that had been deliberately managed. Nothing visibly broken, obvious signs of a struggle at the primary entry point. The kind of scene that to an untrained eye might suggest Nancy had simply stepped out on her own. But deputies were not looking at it with untrained eyes. Her phone was on the table, her wallet, her hearing aid, her medication, her car touched in the garage. Every item she needed to survive was still inside that house. She had not packed. She had not chosen to leave. The scene had been staged to suggest voluntary departure while containing the forensic evidence of everything that had actually happened. Biological traces were documented at the front door of the residence, confirmed through forensic DNA analysis to belong to Nancy Guthrie. Nest's doorbell camera had been physically removed from its housing, not offline, removed. The camera had no active cloud backup subscription, meaning everything it had recorded locally was already overwriting itself and would have been gone. Except that the FBI went to Google and spent 8 days working inside Nest's back-end server architecture to recover what remained. 6 photographs, 3 video clips, pulled back from the digital dark. And what they showed removed any remaining question about whether this was a random or opportunistic crime. This was planned. This was rehearsed. This was executed by people who understood the digital infrastructure of that neighborhood as thoroughly as they understood the layout of the home inside it. In 72 hours of the welfare check call on the morning of February 1st, financial forensics team working through Nancy Guthrie's bank records had flagged a pattern of transactions that did not belong to an 84-year-old woman living alone on a fixed income in the Catalina foothills. The transactions were structured, deliberate, spread across multiple accounts and multiple institutions in a pattern that suggested working knowledge of how financial monitoring thresholds operate. Amounts kept just below the levels that trigger automatic reporting flags. Transfers routed through intermediary accounts before landing in destinations that required additional subpoenas to trace. This was not opportunistic financial exploitation. This was a coordinated financial operation running parallel to and in preparation for the physical operation of January 31st. 2 names kept surfacing in those records: Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans. Cioni's presence in those records required no explanation to investigators who already knew he was the last person confirmed to have been with Nancy. The nature of his financial connection to accounts tied to Nancy's profile was not the kind of connection that results from proximity alone. Transactions, according to sources familiar with the investigation, reflected a level of account knowledge and access that exceeded what a son-in-law would normally possess. Dominic Evans entered the picture through a different channel. Sources indicate investigators tracing the financial transaction network found his name attached to accounts that had received transfers originating funds connected to Nancy Guthrie's estate. The connection between Evans and Cioni, the link that the FBI's investigation kept returning to, was not visible from the surface data. It required cross-referencing 3 separate datasets that the FBI's units had been building independently: communication records, travel logs, a behavioral analysis pattern map. When those 3 datasets were overlaid, what emerged was not 2 individuals acting in parallel. It was a documented pattern of coordinated activity across a shared operational timeline. One individual with insider access to the target. One individual managing the external infrastructure that converted that access into a structured plan. Here is what the FBI's investigation kept returning to, and what most public coverage of this case has completely missed. A figure who appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front door on the night of January 31st was not wearing a disguise. Every element of that $70 kit, the ski mask, the gloves, the backpack, was engineered to make the FBI's behavioral profile point in exactly the wrong direction, to make the operation look like something it was not, to create the forensic appearance of a random, opportunistic crime committed by an unknown individual, when the reality was something far more specific and far more calculated, because the operation was not built overnight. Sources indicate the documentation recovered during the investigation shows a cultivation period extending back at least 18 months before January 31st, 2026. 18 months. Initial contact established through a channel that appeared entirely unrelated to the Guthrie family. Relationship building across weeks, then months. Gradual introduction of financial conversations, small at first, framed as advice, as shared interest, as the kind of talk between people who trust each other, then escalating involvement, small transactions, minor logistical tasks, nothing that would register as significant on its own. Each step calibrated to normalize the next step. Each normalization making the previous boundary feel like it had always been further back than it actually was. By the time the operational plan for January 31st was finalized, the psychological architecture of Cioni's participation had been constructed so carefully that the network's internal documentation, according to sources, describes his role not as a coerced asset, but as a willing participant. Distinction matters legally. That distinction matters forensically. That distinction is the reason the FBI's case against Cioni is built the way it is built. Dominic Evans managed that process, every stage of it. The initial contact, the relationship cultivation, the financial escalation, the operational integration. According to sources, Evans is not described in the investigative record as a peripheral figure with an incidental connection to Cioni. He is described as the individual who identified the access point, built the relationship, and converted 20 years of embedded household access into a specific operational role across a period of nearly 2 years. This is the structural link the FBI found, documented, traced, confirmed by sources. By the second week of February 2026, Joint Task Force had built what appeared to be a solid evidentiary foundation. Financial transactions were documented across multiple institutions. Behavioral profile matched the operational precision of the January 31st entry. Pre-operational surveillance timeline had been partially reconstructed using cell tower data and vehicle movement records. Looked like a clean case heading toward charges. And then the defense teams moved, not in court, not yet, through the channels that experienced legal teams use when they want to introduce friction into a federal investigation before it reaches the charging stage. Procedural challenges to the financial subpoenas, questions about the chain of custody on the cell tower data, formal challenge to the behavioral analysis methodology, arguing that pattern mapping of pre-operational surveillance activity does not meet the evidentiary standard required for probable cause under federal rules. Each challenge individually was manageable. Together, created a gap in the evidentiary chain that the prosecution needed to close before moving forward. Closing that gap required going back to the forensic evidence from the scene, specifically the biological traces that the initial sweep had, documented but that the federal laboratory had not yet fully processed. The case board in the conference room did not change. The names did not change, but the clean, forward-moving energy of a case heading toward resolution began to fracture at its edges. Then the laboratory returned a result that nobody on the task force had prepared for. A second set of biological traces came back from the federal laboratory, not from the primary scene inside Nancy's home. From a vehicle, dark-colored SUV captured on traffic camera footage at 2:31 a.m. on February 1st, 3 minutes after Nancy's cardiac device lost its Bluetooth sync bedside monitor. Traveling northbound on a route consistent with moving away from the Catalina foothills neighborhood toward the interstate, identified through partial plate recognition and a distinctive roof rack configuration matched to a vehicle registered to an address connected to the transaction network investigators had already been mapping. The primary forensic sweep of that vehicle returned 2 profiles consistent with the existing suspect framework. The case was still moving forward. The secondary sweep, run on trace materials collected from the rear cargo area, turned a 3rd profile, not Cioni, not Evans. A 3rd biological signature from an individual whose identity at that point in the investigation was completely unknown to the task force. When that profile was run through the federal database, it did not return a match to anyone connected to the Guthrie case. It returned a match to a name in an active federal case file in a completely separate jurisdiction. The Clean 2 suspect case became something significantly more complex. FBI's Organized Crime Division was called into the room because the separate case file was not a local matter. It was an active investigation into a structured financial network operating across multiple states. A network that had been under federal surveillance for over 14 months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. On the surface, that network had no visible connection to Tucson, Arizona, or to an 84-year-old woman living alone on a fixed income in the Catalina foothills. The FBI does not believe in coincidence when a biological profile bridges 2 active federal investigations. Analysts pulled the parallel case file and began cross-referencing communication records, financial transaction maps, travel logs from both investigations simultaneously. What emerged from that cross-referencing process was a pattern that the behavioral analysis unit described, according to sources, as a recruitment and deployment pipeline, a structured system through which individuals with specific insider access to high-value targets were identified, cultivated, and activated for coordinated financial and physical operations. Cioni's name appeared in that pipeline documentation as a documented connection point, individual identified by the network based on his proximity to Nancy Guthrie's financial profile and his 2 decades of embedded household access. 3rd profile, the unknown individual recovered from the rear cargo area of the vehicle, is described by sources as an operational supervisor, not a local actor, not someone connected to Tucson. Someone deployed specifically for the January 31st operation from outside the state, connected to the network's financial infrastructure going back 22 months before Nancy disappeared. Sources indicate the FBI identified at least 2 prior operations consistent with the same methodology, same cultivation approach, same operational structure, same financial routing architecture, different locations, different targets, different insider assets, same network. FBI's Organized Crime Division made a calculated call. Watch, document. The network operate long enough to expose the full architecture before closing it down was the right call from an investigative strategy standpoint. Closing on Cioni alone would have produced a local arrest in a missing persons case. Watching the network move would produce the documentation needed to dismantle an operation that extended far beyond one neighborhood in Tucson. Nancy Guthrie had been missing for 30 days. Then 45, then 60. The pressure to move did not come from outside the investigation, it came from inside it. from the agents who had spent weeks building the network map and who understood better than anyone exactly what the operational supervisor's presence in that vehicle meant for Nancy's condition and location. There is a specific kind of weight that builds inside a federal investigation when the strategic decision to watch conflicts with the urgent human reality of what is being watched. Every experienced federal prosecutor in that room understood both the investigative logic of patience and the human cost of it. And those two things do not sit comfortably next to each other across 60 days of waiting. Breakthrough that resolved that tension came not from the financial data or the biological traces. It came from digital communication metadata. The content of communications metadata, timestamps, device identifiers, cell tower handoffs, encrypted application activity logs that exist independently of message content and are accessible through federal warrant without requiring decryption of the communications themselves. The FBI's cyber division built a metadata map of the communication patterns between the three individuals from the moment the organized crime division joined the task force. In the 6th week of the investigation, that map produced something actionable. A pattern of recurring communication activity placing all three individuals in digital proximity to a specific geographic corridor at specific intervals, not a GPS coordinate, a corridor narrow enough to focus resources, wide enough to protect the surveillance window, until the full architecture was documented. FBI narrowed that corridor over the following 2 weeks using a combination of cell tower triangulation, financial transaction geolocation, coordinated surveillance assets deployed along the identified range. Each data point tightened the picture. Each tightening increased the urgency because by that point the network was showing signs of awareness. Communication frequency dropping, transaction patterns shifting. The operational supervisor's digital signature becoming intermittent in ways consistent with counter-surveillance behavior. The network knew it was being watched, not with certainty, with enough suspicion to begin modifying its patterns. And a network that begins modifying its patterns is a network preparing to go dark. Background of all of this, the genealogical analysis of the third biological profile had been running since the 3rd week of investigation, not a standard database match. A genealogical reconstruction, building a biological family map from the DNA data and working backward, identified relatives to the unidentified subject. The kind of analysis that identifies individuals who have never personally submitted a sample to any federal database by finding the relatives who have. That analysis completed its full processing cycle in the weeks before the corridor narrowed to its final range. The name it returned connected directly to the 14-month parallel investigation, placed the operational supervisor not just in the vehicle on February 1st, but in documented contact with the net financial infrastructure, going back 22 months before Nancy disappeared. The corridor was narrowed, the name was confirmed, the window was closing. According to sources connected to the federal investigation, the FBI stopped watching. Sources connected to the federal investigation indicate that in early May 2026, following the completion of the genealogical analysis and the final narrowing of the geographic corridor, Tommaso Cioni was taken into federal custody in connection with the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. This was not the end of the investigation. It was the moment the FBI gained legal leverage it did not have the day before, the right to ask, in a formal, legally structured setting, questions that only one person in custody can answer. What does an arrest at this stage of a federal investigation mean in practical terms? It means the evidentiary foundation built across 100 days, financial forensics, behavioral analysis, metadata mapping, genealogical DNA processing, cross-jurisdictional case file integration, was assessed as sufficient by federal prosecutors to support charges. It means there is now a person in a room with federal investigators who was present in Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of January 31st. Person who knows the operational plan, who knows the network's logistics, who knows where the vehicle was designed to go after it left the Catalina foothills at 2:28 a.m. The negotiation happening right now, quiet, procedural, entirely outside public view, is the most consequential thing occurring in this case at this moment. On one side of the table, federal investigators who have spent 100 days building the most comprehensive forensic picture of this operation that any agency has produced, who know the financial architecture, the recruitment timeline, the network's geography, the identity of the operational supervisor deployed from outside the state. On the other side, defense team making calculations about what can be offered, what can be demonstrated, version of events limits exposure, and what version of events opens doors. Between them, the one piece of information that no amount of forensic analysis has yet produced. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Documented connection between Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans is the evidentiary foundation on which this entire federal case is being built, not the financial link established in the first week, not the operational link established when the recruitment documentation was cross-referenced parallel investigation. The structural link, the documented evidence that what happened on January 31st was not the beginning of a plan, but the execution of one built across years. 18 months of cultivation, 22 months of network infrastructure building, recruitment process that had identified Cioni as a connection point based on 3 specific factors: his proximity to Nancy's financial profile, his 2 decades of household access, and a set of personal financial pressures that the network had mapped and was actively leveraging. FBI's documented record of that cultivation process is described by sources as granular. Initial contact through a channel appearing unrelated to the Guthrie family. Relationship building. Gradual financial escalation. Peripheral operational involvement. Each step designed to normalize the next. Each normalization making the previous boundary feel like it had always been further back than it actually was. Dominic Evans managed every stage of that process. According to sources, Evans is not described in the investigative record as a peripheral figure with an incidental connection to Cioni. He is described as the individual who identified the access point, built the relationship, converted proximity into operational participation across a period of nearly 2 years. The architect of Cioni's involvement, the external operator managing the infrastructure. The link between an insider with access and a network with the resources to convert that access into a structured plan. And the network itself, the structured operation that the Organized Crime Division had been mapping for 14 months before it touched Nancy Guthrie's life, is described by sources as having documented at least 2 prior operations using the same methodology, same cultivation approach, same financial routing, same operational structure. Nancy's case is not an isolated incident in that record, documented node in a pattern that the FBI's Organized Crime Division is now working to map in full, a pattern that extends across state, lines and targets individuals with the same specific vulnerability profile, limited mobility, medication dependency, significant financial assets, family structures that provide insider access opportunities. The FBI has a name at the center of it. The FBI has a network surrounding that name. As of early May 2026, one of those individuals is no longer operating outside custody. 100 days, not a number on a case board, not a metric in a federal report. 100 mornings that Annie Guthrie woke up without knowing where her mother was. 100 evenings where a porch in the Catalina foothills sat empty in the desert air. 100 days of a garden untended, church pew unfilled, a name on a tip line that 50,000 people called because they could not let it go. Forensic architecture of this case has produced documented answers about the individuals involved, financial network that funded the operation, the recruitment pipeline that built it, the metadata map that narrowed the corridor, genealogical analysis that identified the third profile. All of that is established. All of that is confirmed by sources. All of that represents 100 days of federal investigation, doing exactly what federal investigation is designed to do. Nancy Guthrie has still not been found. The cardiac regulating device implanted in her chest is still out there, still recording. Every heartbeat logged, every location transition embedded in the data pattern, every physiological response timestamped with a precision that cannot be altered after the fact. According to sources familiar with the investigative record, that device data is recoverable. The device does not lie, does not have legal representation, it does not invoke procedural protections. If it can be located and brought within range of a compatible receiver, it will tell investigators more about Nancy Guthrie's condition and location history over the past 100 days than any witness statement or financial record could provide. That is not speculation. It is the documented capability of the device model. The arrest changes the geometry of that search. Before early May 2026, FBI was working the network from the outside, mapping, documenting, narrowing. After the arrest, is a person in a room who was present in Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of January 31st. Person who knows where the operation was designed to go after the vehicle left the Catalina foothills at 2:28 in the morning. Every hour that passes after an arrest in a networked operation is an hour during which the remaining nodes are making decisions about what to preserve, what to move, and where to restructure. The FBI's Organized Crime Division is monitoring those adaptation patterns right now, in real time, as this documentary is being watched. Savannah Guthrie sat behind the desk of the Today Show and delivered morning news to millions of people throughout those 100 days. She has spoken publicly about what the family has allowed themselves to acknowledge, that her mother may no longer be alive, that if the worst had happened, they would accept it, but that they need to know where she is. That is not surrender. It is a daughter choosing truth over hope, choosing certainty over the specific exhaustion of not knowing, asking not for a miracle, but for the one conversation, the one specific, legally structured conversation between a federal investigator and a man in custody that turns 100 days of documented architecture into a direction, road, a location. Think about what this investigation has assembled. A coordinated operation executed on a planned schedule by a minimum of 2 individuals working simultaneous entry points. Financial architecture spread across multiple institutions and multiple states. A recruitment pipeline operating for 18 months before January 31st. Third biological profile connecting the Guthrie abduction to a network the FBI had been watching for over a year. Genealogical analysis identifying an operational supervisor deployed from outside the state. Metadata map that narrowed a geographic corridor to a range that surveillance assets could cover. And an arrest. All of that is built. All of that is documented. All of that represents the most significant federal investigative achievement in this case since the night Annie Guthrie, the welfare check call on the morning of February 1st, 2026. And behind all of it, behind the metadata maps and the genealogical analysis and recruitment pipeline documentation and the financial subpoenas and the behavioral analysis reports, there is an 84-year-old woman, a mother, grandmother, a widow who built a full life in the Sonoran Desert across 5 decades and who did not ask for any of this and who has not been seen since a garage door closed behind her on a quiet Saturday night. Nancy Guthrie. The FBI found the link. Structural connection between 2 individuals that the new investigative record documents in granular detail. Link that made the May 2026 arrest possible. The link that partially exposed a network that the Organized Crime Division is now working to fully dismantle. But finding the link is not the same as finding Nancy, and that distinction between what the investigation has documented and what it has not yet recovered is the only distinction that matters to 3 children who have spent 100 days waiting for their mother to come home. Next development in this investigation will not come from a forensic laboratory, not come from a financial transaction map or a metadata analysis or a genealogical database. It will come from a conversation, a specific, consequential, legally structured conversation between federal investigators and a man who was inside Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of January 31, 2026. And who knows exactly where the operation was designed to go. That conversation is happening now, or it is about to happen, or it has already happened. And the results are moving through the legal architecture that governs what can be disclosed and when. If you have any information about this case, anything at all, the tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can submit anonymously at tips.fbi.gov. The reward stands at over $1.2 million. Tips are completely anonymous. Payment is available in cash. Nancy Guthrie has been gone for 100 days. Family is still waiting, and this investigation does not close until she is found.
Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more information like this. Thanks. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.